Buenas, bienvenidos, bienvenidas. Arrancamos la segunda charla magistral del programa Latinográficas. Yo soy Jasmine Acuña, soy cofundadora y directora editorial del Surtidor. Les agradezco mucho por acompañarnos hoy. Disculpen la pequeña tardanza, tuvimos un problemita técnico, pero ya lo resolvimos. Hoy tenemos a un invitado de habla inglesa, por lo que vamos a contar con la traducción simultánea de María Laura Justice, que nos acompaña hoy. Ella va a ser la intérprete. Así que pueden elegir el idioma de la sala en la parte inferior de la pantalla, ahí en donde dice traducciones, interpretación. Ahí pueden entrar para elegir el idioma en el que prefieran escuchar la charla. Es de verdad una gran emoción darle continuidad al ciclo de charlas magistrales que son abiertas a la comunidad de nuestro programa, a todas las personas interesadas en lo que estamos haciendo en Latinográficas. Les cuento que este es el tercer año que realizamos el programa. Buscamos potenciar el periodismo visual en Latinoamérica, transformando trabajos periodísticos en piezas que son fáciles de leer, de entender y de compartir. Nuestro objetivo es llegar con la mejor información ahí donde está la gente, las redes sociales y los sistemas de mensajería. Esto lo hacemos con el equipo del Surtidor, que nos acompaña, y también becarias y becarios de la tercera edición de nuestro programa, a quienes me gustaría presentarles: Gabriela Gulich, de São Paulo, ella es de ECO; Andreina Escala, de Quito, ella es de Ecuador, de GK; Alma Ríos, de Ciudad de México, de distintas latitudes; Karen Lara, de Ciudad de Guatemala, de Ruda; Julieta Bugakov, de Buenos Aires, de LATFEM; y Richard Romero, de Cali, de Mungabay, Latam. Latinográficas no sería posible sin la colaboración de aliados. La temática, el tema que cubrimos este año es la crisis climática, y estamos trabajando con Tierra de Resistentes para eso. Es un proyecto de Consejo de Redacción de Colombia que monitorea los hechos de violencia contra defensores ambientales en Latinoamérica. Bueno, antes de recibir a nuestro invitado de hoy, quiero darles un par de avisos. Por favor, dejen sus preguntas escritas en el chat. Al final de la presentación de nuestro invitado, vamos a compartirle las preguntas para que él las responda. Disfruten de la presentación, quédense atentos a nuestras redes. Vamos a compartir una relatoría luego de esta charla, profundizando en los conceptos que vamos a revisar hoy. Bien, ahora voy a cambiar al inglés para recibir a nuestro invitado, Ruben Pater. You can turn on your camera if you want. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. We've been looking up for this opportunity to hear you for quite a while now. Hi, Maria. There she is. Thank you so much. Ruben Pater is a designer and researcher from Amsterdam in the Netherlands. He approaches graphic design with a critical eye. Under the name Untold Stories, Pater creates visual narratives that support solidarity, justice, and equality. In his first book, The Politics of Design, he explores cultural bias in graphic design. And his most recent book, Caps Lock, Ruben looks at the role of graphic design in capitalism. And so we are very happy to hear you, Ruben. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. Thank you so much, Maria, for interpreting. And thank you so much for Latinográficas for inviting me. So I'm going to share my screen so you can see my presentation. Let me
yes,
see.
Please go ahead.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So my presentation today is going to be called Popular Journalism. A little bit maybe about my background. For 10 years, I worked as a graphic designer after graduating from art school in commercial companies, doing a lot of branding, but also a lot of editorial design, actually. And yeah, then I started to wonder why I was always asked to work for clients that had a lot of money rather than working for causes that were more important for, let's say, the public good. So I decided to do a master degree to kind of explore my skills and how I could use them. So here you see the first work I made after I finished my master's. It's called the Drone Survival Guide. The idea is that at that time, drones were a lot in the news. People were very confused about what they could do and yeah, the kind of technologies behind them. So I decided to make this kind of map of all the most used drones types organized by scale. So you see that this is in 2 languages. This was important for me. This is in English and Pashtun, the language spoken in the border of Afghanistan and Pakistan. And the reason why is because many times if critical projects are made about these kind of topics, they're done in English. That excludes the large majority of the world population. So this work also because in drone warfare, you have the pilot and the actual plane being in a completely different part of the world. This connection is also kind of emphasized by these 2 languages. So I printed this on mirrored paper, and on the back there's these ways to avoid drones or even hack them. I did it myself. I paid for the project myself. I decided to put them on a website. If you go to dronesurvivalguide.org, you can download it for free, but you can also buy this poster. So the idea was to share the information that I gathered for free. So you can download it and print it yourself, but you can also buy it if you prefer. So this quickly got a lot of attention, and many people actually volunteered to make translations of the guide. So there's a version in Spanish and Portuguese about Latin America with different drone types. There's a Russian one about Eastern Europe. There's one about the border of Mexico and the US. There's one in Hebrew and Arabic about Palestine and Israel. So in this way, I found a way to make money from my project in a small way, but also share the knowledge with the community to see this as a kind of citizen journalism, as it were. This is a project I did after that. So this was at the time when Edward Snowden was sharing his leaks about espionage around the world, digital espionage, and a lot of these tactics and news things were very complicated, right? Many people find it very difficult to understand how the United States and other European nations could hack into your phone, hack into your computer, listen to your phone calls, all these things. So I proposed to a big Dutch newspaper to make a puzzle every week explaining one of these espionage tactics. As you know, puzzles are a normal thing in newspapers, but I wanted to make a graphic puzzle that explains something about digital espionage. And because puzzling is also a form of encryption, right? So solving puzzles is a part of espionage. For me, the idea was that people, by solving puzzles, could learn something about espionage while also solving kind of cryptography. Making a whole year, one every week, was not so easy, but it was interesting. I think an interesting experiment. And there also was this is for a German exhibition. They produced some of the espionage puzzles. They produced them in a booklet, like a puzzle book, with a portrait of Edward Snowden, a puzzle portrait on the cover. And this is like the inside. So you see every puzzle had like a short part of text, and I did all the research and all the drawing myself. So that was an interesting kind of way of doing that. So this also got me thinking a little bit about not just creating this kind of visual journalism for the public, but also thinking about how journalism itself and graphic design, how these are actually influenced politically, and how also the practice of design is part of this kind of political narrative. So I decided to use my experience working for studios for 10 years, to use that experience to think about kind of cultural biases and the cultural connotation of design. And this led to my first book in 2016 called Politics of Design. Unfortunately, this is not available in Spanish. There's a Portuguese translation that was published in Brazil that is really great. So I wasn't really, I didn't have the ambition to become a writer, but I wanted to make this book because I really learned through my work in design that design is never neutral. That design is always made from a certain perspective because the designer holds a kind of cultural bias, right? For example, I use English and Dutch, and in other countries, people use different languages. They use different colors, they use different writing systems, but also the way that we read images is very culturally dependent. And the problem is that often the idea is that design is neutral, but the kind of design that is often mentioned is European design, or design for the global north of the United States. So I wanted to kind of explain this to designers using visual examples. So one of them is this one. This is from Henry Dreyfuss from 1959. called the measurements of men. So Henry Dreyfuss was an industrial designer and architect, and he thought it was really important to use the measurements of the human body to create chairs, tables, architecture, etc. Of course, this is, I think, a very good moment in design. This book is also still being used in art schools and design schools. But at the moment you create a standard like this, there's automatically also an exclusionary aspect to this. First of all, we see that all of the body types in the world are basically presented as a binary choice between a man and a woman, completely ignoring other forms of gender, other body types, right? So already it positions this kind of this kind of very conservative idea of gender, where you have a man and a woman as the only possible kind of body types. Secondly, these measurements, so where did they come from? So if you start looking into this, the measurements of the men actually come from the US military, because US men for the US military had to be measured. This is like the standard of all the men being measured. So when we think about these standards, these are not the average men or woman in the world. No, these are military-aged males from the United States from the 1950s. So then we realize that we actually, by introducing standards, and in design we need standards, we also exclude a lot of other kind of options and nuances through this kind of efficiency of industrial production. So this is really important to think about when we use industrial standards. An industrial standard that is maybe a little bit more graphic design is this one. You might recognize it because it's used internationally. So this set of icons was designed in the United States in 1974. It's also called the Helvetica Man by Alan Lupton. And it's kind of seen as a neutral set of icons used for wayfinding in airports and in cities, right? But when we look closer, we see a lot of like cultural differences. For example, we see that the image for ticket counter is a man buying a ticket from a woman, which is a very, let's say, outdated and even sexist way of looking at, a ticket counter. The second one is we see a restaurant icon as a knife and a fork, and not in every country in the world. These are the standard eating utensils, right? And the last one is, of course, no parking. We're talking about the letter P from the Latin alphabet and an English word. So this also assumes a lot of kind of cultural context already. And when we look at some of these objects here that we see together, when you look at one of those objects, you might not realize it's racial bias, but when we see them together, we actually realize how strange it is that the white skin is always taken as a kind of standard in these kind of objects, right? And this goes even further when we talk about technology. These cards, called Shirley cards, were used actually to create Kodak film from the United States. And in the 1950s and 60s, these women were used with a very light skin to create this kind of, make these technical cards to test the film. And because these women had such a light skin, this film was notoriously unable to photograph people of color in an equally convincing way. So this is a really interesting example that Jean-Luc Godard, the filmmaker, refused to use Kodak film when he went to film in Mozambique, because he said this film was actually racist by design. So then we see how even in technological standards, racial bias can be included. When we talk about gender, and this is an example from editorial design, we also see that designers are actually able to not only enforce gender norms, but also actively create them. Exposing young women, young men to these kind of stereotypes forces people into kind of gender role, and media has a very big part to play in that. If you think about how many kind of messages of media and advertising we see every day. So my point is that designers have a responsibility in kind of putting images and ideas into the world, thinking about how they might influence young people in this case. Of course, maps is a very clear way, also often used in journalism, how to have a kind of ideological impact. So I will explain a little bit how that works. This is the Mercator projection. So this is a type of map that was first designed in 1569. So this is from colonial times, made in what was then Belgium. So that's why Europe is in the middle, because the Earth doesn't have a center, it's a sphere. Any point in the sphere can be a center. So the middle of the map is always from the viewpoint of the person drawing the map, right? Or the person ordering to have the map drawn. Also, this map was made in colonial times for these kind of horrible conquest voyages made from Europe, which is why it's based on compass directions, because ships were using those. That means that the map is very distorted in terms of size. So if you look at Australia in the right bottom corner and Greenland in the bottom left corner, Australia is actually 3.5 times bigger in size than Greenland, although it looks smaller here. So this map has been called colonialist because it distorts the map in such a way that the bottom part of the map, which means America Latina, which means Africa and Southeast Asia and Australia, appear to look much smaller than they in fact are. You see that really well with this version of the map, which is an equal size map from 1973, where you see actually that this was a response to the Mercator projection made in Germany. So this is why Europe is still in the middle. But you see that the sizes of the continents appear completely different. So in this map, the sizes are better. It's better to compare the sizes in this particular map, for example. So you see already using a different world map completely changes the ideological and political viewpoint on the world. And so far, we've just been talking about a kind of Western colonial style of mapping, but this is an indigenous map. There's many indigenous mapping practices also from the Mexica, also from many parts of the world, also from indigenous people in North America that are really interesting and offer completely different viewpoints on how we see land and how we actually navigate. So this map from the Inuit in Greenland actually uses wood to carve out the form of the East Coast. And the reason why this map is very, very well designed is that, first of all, it's made out of wood. That means you can drop it in the water. There's no roads, so people have to navigate on water. So if you drop it into the water, it will stay afloat. A paper map would not work there. Also, because it's cut out of wood, you can feel it with your hands. That means you don't need light. And the polar night can be extremely dark, even for months on end. So this map has a very different way of looking at land and how to navigate, but in its own ingenious way, I would say. And I think this is also a reminder that often enough, too much in design education, we're focusing on telling the story of design from a European perspective. However, we can write a whole history of design without ever mentioning Europe and all the brilliant kind of design knowledge that comes from, for example, indigenous cultures, but also, of course, all other cultures outside of Europe or North America or the global North. So I think it's really important to also understand that design can be found anywhere in the world, and any place in the world has an equally interesting history in design, although differently communicated. I like this example. This talks about reading direction. Spanish and English read from left to right. However, many languages in the world, among other Ethiopian languages, Arabic and Hebrew, read from right to left. That also means the whole story and the whole visual order of the story changes, right? So I was giving Dutch language classes to migrants, and in order to educate us on cultural differences, the teachers were giving kind of this assignment. So I'll do it with you. The top one says, which facial expression fits the expression best? The shadow sides of life. So I'm from the Netherlands. This is a cold country. You see I'm wearing a scarf. So I would choose the right one because, yeah, this shadow is not considered like a positive thing in the Netherlands. However, you could also argue if you're from a country where it's very hot and maybe even in conditions like deserts, shadow is actually a very positive aspect. So whatever people choose can be very culturally dependent. So the bottom one says, describe the development you see here in a short sentence using the words trees and thunder. So I read from left to right, so I would say the thunder is coming towards the trees. But if you read from right to left, you would say it's moving away from the trees, completely changing the meaning of the story. So you will see already with these two simple exercises how cultural differences can actually impact visual communication in a major way. So I want to kind of stop here a little bit and focus on this quote by Arturo Escobar, who's a Colombian anthropologist and philosopher, because what he says, and I really like this, he says, from fitting all worlds into one, we have to go to a world where many worlds fit. Historically, Europeans have tried to fit everyone in the world into their culture, and I think now we are realizing the damage that this has done, and it's very important to kind of acknowledge that we have to look at a more pluralist way of seeing at the world, understanding that knowledge can be found everywhere and that viewpoints from all parts of the world are equally valid. And I think this is a very positive and also a very inspiring kind of thought that I really took from making this book. So I want to share now a few projects, because you also might be wondering what kind of other projects I have been doing since. So when we talk about this popular journalism, the first project that kind of brought me to this, besides the kind of pre-work that you just saw before, is this one called Camping Kafka. I was invited by a Dutch artist to look at why people live in campings in the Netherlands. So campings in the Netherlands are not just tents. We have the most amount of campings per capita of any country in the world. And people stay in this kind of like bungalows. And this is how people in the 50s and 60s would spend their vacations. Of course, now with cheap flights to Turkey, to Spain, to France, most Dutch people actually go abroad for holiday to go to the warm weather. And many of these campings are now actually empty. Many people who own these campings are complaining that the campings could not be filled anymore. So they started to rent out these houses for people to live, not just for holiday. Mostly people who needed urgently a house. In the Netherlands, we have a scarcity of housing, being a very small country with a high population. So we're talking about labor migrants, we're talking about people in a divorce, we're talking about people who have a big debt and who cannot have access otherwise to a house. So sooner or later, these places became filled up with people who have basically nowhere else to go. And they became kind of branded in the media as criminals, as people who are poor, who are victimized. So we wanted to know what's going on. Now, this friend of mine, he always does this kind of field work. He's a social worker by trade. So through him, I learned that there's kind of no substitute for actually talking to people. And this sounds like a very obvious statement, but graphic designers are often very much used of doing everything online, looking up information, and doing research by actually talking to people, visiting places, doing field work is entirely different than actually reading about something. And I had to really learn that here. And that turned out to be a very valuable experience, because I realized that the people live here, they don't want to be seen as victims. People who are poor, who are living on a small budget, who are migrant workers, they don't want to be victimized, they want to be empowered. So using photography, showing people that are poor, showing people that are in need, is actually harming kind of their self-esteem, but it's also framing it in a media way as that they're victimized and I'm looking them through the lens of a victim. And I think this is something that journalism can do that can be very harmful. However, by talking to these people, we realized that the reason why these people were on campings were not because they were poor or because they were victims, it's because of Dutch bureaucracy. So I decided, because the Netherlands is a very, very organized country. We have a very strict bureaucracy where everything depends on your address and all these kind of details. So I decided to start mapping this whole Dutch bureaucracy. And this was a really, really big job, trying to understand, okay, if you don't get this subsidy, if you don't get this kind of healthcare, you end up there. And if you come from prison, but then you're released when you're 18, then what happens to you? So I was mapping like kind of all these ways where people end up on campsites. Basically, this project turned out, through the wisdom and the knowledge of the people that we spoke to, turned out to be a project about bureaucracy, about how bureaucracy pushes people to the margins of society and actually causes them to be in these kind of, I would say very dire conditions. So in the end, this was also not really a design project. What we made is we turned this maze, what you just saw, into this maze that we put, we used emojis to explain to people and explain especially to people from the government and social workers how people end up in these places. But like I said, we didn't want to use photography because we didn't want to make people poor or victims. So that's why we decided to use emojis. However, there's no emojis for poverty, or there's no emojis for migrant workers, or the left one is a policeman allowing illegal activity to happen. So I had to make them. Most emojis are actually about products. They don't really talk about issues like hunger or being broke or being in debt. So my job was actually mostly to create these emojis, to create this kind of big maze to explain people about how the Dutch bureaucracy works. And that's basically all the design work I ended up doing. the most important thing that we actually ended up doing is we realized migrant workers, architects, people from the government, social workers, they don't speak to one another, they talk about one another. So our most important thing was to bring people together, to have a discussion on a neutral ground in an artwork to discuss these issues. So that's actually sometimes better is not to design, better is to just facilitate a discussion between people. Also to inform politicians, we also ended up making an application that people can actually go through this whole maze. You get assigned like a role, like now you are you are a migrant worker, and then you have to get out of a very difficult situation. This confronts based on detailed analysis of the Dutch bureaucracy, and this really like teaches also politicians how Dutch politics and their use of bureaucracy can actually be very harmful and pushing people into very dire and actually even poverty conditions. So the knowledge that I learned with this project is that I really have to do field research when I want to understand social issues. I really have to talk to people, and not just to one person, but many different people. And this was close to elections, and I was really interested in why the Dutch youth were not voting. Dutch youth are the group of in Dutch society who votes the least, and they really don't care about politics, hence the name. So what I did for this project, I wanted to interview 20 Dutch youth between, let's say, 14 and 19 years, and ask them not about politics, because I knew they didn't like politics. I wanted to ask them about their life. I wanted to ask them what they cared for. I wanted to ask about their neighborhood, about their family. If you don't care about politics, what do you care about? And what was really amazing, and I worked together with a group of young filmmakers, what was really amazing is that it turned out actually these young people are very political. They have a very strong political beliefs, but they don't see that as political, because if you use the word politics, they think about the House of Representatives, they think about people in suits, they think about boring stuff like laws, but they want to talk about the right to wear a headscarf at your work. Of course, this is completely political, but they don't see it this way. So it was really fascinating to see these young people, people often with very little education, also not only the highest educated of society, to really see that they have a very detailed and outspoken analysis of society based on their own experiences. And I think that is really amazing for me to see. For example, this young man from Amsterdam, he was complaining about police violence, but he was also talking about poverty in his own area, and where he was saying through gentrification that when he turns 18, he has to leave the city that he has been living in for all his life. He has to leave because his parents don't have money to buy a house for him, because housing in Amsterdam is so expensive. So these were very, very valuable lessons for me. And just to share that with the world through Instagram videos and memes was what we ended up doing. There were stories about, gender. This person was bicultural and also bisexual. There was about how you look at politicians, about what politicians are doing wrong, about what kind of language they use. So in a very amazing way, they were kind of sharing with me and giving me so much insight into not just how politics is being practiced, but also how politics is not communicated to people. In order to understand politics, you have to become a politician, learn their language and learn their behavior, rather than that politicians try actually to understand what it is to live as a normal human being, to live on a minimum wage, or to be in school at 17 and have a huge student debt. So in the end, we ended up making a series of videos. So I'm going to share one video now. It's in Dutch, but it's subtitled in English. So it might be a bit difficult to understand, also difficult for the interpreter, but at least it will give you kind of idea about the kind of stories and the kind of emotions behind the work.
Vertel Emma, wat ben je aan het doen?
Ik ben even bezig met mijn bord. Dit is poging 3 van het bord. We gaan het niet hebben over de eerder pogingen, want het is een beetje gênant. Nou, we zijn nu onderweg naar Den Haag. We zitten in een overvolle trein, zoals je kan horen. Er zitten superveel jongeren met borden in. We hebben ook al gehoord dat in Utrecht overspoelt van de jongeren met borden, dus dat is echt helemaal top. En we hebben er zin in, hè Maarten? Ja.
Oh, die politiek shit boeit me niet meer. Ja toch? En nu lach je, nou, is niet grappig. Die politiek shit boeit me niet.
Politiek zelf is vaag. Ik weet ook nog steeds niet het verschil tussen links en rechts. Dus vaak zijn het ook dingen die dan mij niet zo heel veel interesseren, zoals hoeveel geld er nou naar de overheid gaat. Weet je, zoals ook naar het leger, dat soort dingen. Soms hoor ik wel van mijn oma of zo, weet je wel. Meer hou ik ook niet echt mee bezig.
Ik zie politiek meer als iets, als dat je overal wel iets van kan vinden, in plaats van dat je jezelf ervoor afsluit. Meer je ogen openen, dat vind ik eigenlijk politiek.
We zijn heel erg grote luxe gewend. En we denken niet echt na over de gevolgen van onze keuzes. En juist heel die disconnectie, doordat we allemaal in hele gefabriceerde steden leven, helemaal los van de natuur. Die hele disconnectie met de natuur is in mijn optiek toch wel de reden dat mensen geen verantwoordelijkheid en geen schuldgevoel voelen.
Ik vind milieu heel belangrijk. Er zijn heel veel signalen dat het er allemaal niet zo goed mee gaat. En ook qua de omgeving en dieren en alles. Ik heb het idee dat er niet genoeg naar gekeken wordt. En ik denk dat dan met de Thierry Baudet.
Ik geloof niet dat er een klimaatprobleem is. Ik geloof ook niet dat, voor zover het klimaat inderdaad verandert, zoals altijd verandert, de mens daar een hele grote invloed op heeft.
Ja, dan denk ik van steek nou je hoofd in het zand of hou je gewoon niet met belangrijke dingen bezig. Want iedereen houdt zich wel bezig met economie en geld, wat uiteindelijk maar een papiertje is. Maar wanneer op een gegeven moment alle bomen weg zijn en jouw zuurstof raakt op, of wie wil ergens gaan wonen, maar elke week is er een modderstroom. Ja, dan ben je toch, waar ben je dan met je geld? Dan kun je een mooi huis bouwen van je geld, of waar ga je er dan mee doen?
Zeg dus, we zijn op je maanigeld!
Ik moest hem van de politie eigenlijk weggooien toen ik terugliep van die klimaatmars. Zei ze, ja maar dit is aanstootgevend voor andere mensen. En ik zo, ik heb echt een positieve tekst op staan, weet je wel. Het is niet alsof erop staat, fuck Rutte, weet je wel. Dat staat er niet op, er is echt niks aan de hand. Het was van, ja dat mag niet. En ik dacht, vrijheid van meningsuiting, wat is dit? Ik moest hem dubbel houden, maar hij is nu weer recht.
Ik denk dat het enige wat ertoe doet, is het werken aan een fijne leefomgeving. Met fijne leefomgeving voor mensen bedoel ik dus gewoon natuur. Dat is waar ik zie dat mensen gelukkig van worden, waar we thuis horen. Mensen moeten dat uit zichzelf willen en ze kunnen het alleen willen als ze de ernst ervan inzien. En dat zien ze er alleen van in als zij een band hebben met de natuur.
Ik denk dat de nadruk iets minder zou moeten liggen op het geld. In principe. Maar ja, dat is denk ik wel ook heel lastig om een heel systeem en heel veel landen daarop te draaien. Dat is ook niet zo makkelijk te veranderen.
Ik denk dat een soort van collectief bewustzijn daarin iets is wat nu nagestreefd moet worden. En een zekere mate van verantwoordelijkheid nemen. En dat is iets waar je nu voor zou kunnen inzetten. En ja, dat is ook iets wat ik wil doen met mijn leven.
All right, thank you for your patience. And I hope it was okay for the people who were not able to read English. So what this project really taught me is that that all my assumptions about young people, all my assumptions about what people feel about politics were challenged. And these young people were giving me so much energy and so much hope about the future. And that there's so much knowledge to be found in people that don't necessarily have a diploma or degree, don't necessarily study in university, but there's tremendous amount of knowledge in people. And by kind of shutting that out and creating the hierarchies that we have in society, we sometimes tend to only listen to people who have a voice in the media. So that brought me to rethinking my own practice and how I could build a practice that was more ethical, that was more local, was more listening to local voices, and less trying to, you know, I don't know, less be about the individual creative genius of the designer, not about winning awards, but about adding value to your own community and to your neighborhood. And this, yeah, this made me kind of write my second book that came out last year called Caps Lock, which is basically a book about design and capitalism. I almost knew very little about economics before I started writing this book, so it took me 4 years. But in the end, I realized that there was a reason to write this, and there was also a reason to link it to design. And this book really taught me a lot about how the economic system works and how that is also related to the political issues I've kind of raised before. First of all, that many of the documents that designers create are actually not only necessary, but fundamental to the idea of economy. And that even started with the first found written objects, the first graphic documents. These are from Mesopotamia from 5,000 years ago. These are actually receipts. They are not poems, they are not love letters, because before there was a writing, there was already accounting. So the first kind of graphic documents that are left, that we have found, are actually receipts. And if you think about it, it's not so unlogical, because the cities in Mesopotamia were 200,000 big, and you needed to trade with strangers. And if you need to trade with a stranger, then just giving your word is not enough. Just knowing your name is not enough. You need a kind of evidence, and graphic documents play that role very well. You know, specialists, of course, almost nobody could make these documents. So the people who were trained to make these documents had the power to create trust in the economic transaction. And this is in 1666, the first European banknote. This is like 4,000 years later, it has hardly changed, right? So you see there's still a graphic document using ornaments, using the printing press, using different typefaces, using autographs and stamps, all to make sure that we believe that the bank has coins, the bank has the coins to back up this banknote that the person that would be trading was carrying around, right? So we realize that these documents are necessary to create a trust in between people in economic transactions. And that we see with with the first colonial conquest done from the Netherlands with the Dutch East India Company in the 1600s, what we also see is the first emergence of this kind of financial reporting language, right? So on the left, you see the first financial newspaper from 1636. The first stock exchange was in the Netherlands. And the only reason this was in the Netherlands because of the Dutch East India Company, you know, pillaging and enslaving people worldwide. But because many people were investing in these companies, these were the first multinationals, it was very important to keep communicating what was happening to the ships, what was happening to the price of the resources that we're carrying. And you see that the language that they use is not so different today when we look at a financial newspaper. Even infographics, so this is a famous example from William Playfair, who is the father of modern infographics. He created the bar chart and the pie chart and many of these kind of forms. He was an economist. He used his infographics to communicate information about the economy. This is most of the work that he did. And it's very logical that we use mathematics and we use the language of numbers and infographics to communicate economy. However, when we look at the world through this lens, when we look at the world that is a collection of people, social processes, nature and natural processes, and the only thing we see is numbers, something is also lost. Because we create an abstract language of profits and losses, but we don't see that behind every number is a family, is somebody's house, is rainforest being cut down. You know, so all of these violent things that are happening, we don't see behind these numbers, and that it becomes very easy for a person taking economic decisions to take decisions of life and death, to take these kind of horrible decisions. So what I want to say with this, that I think it's really important that we kind of reconnect to this kind of social origin of economy, that economy is ultimately people making things together with things from nature, or just making things together with things that they can create. These are social processes. And the fact that we can do this differently as designers and journalists, I think is shown in this example of Gapminder. Gapminder is from Sweden, and they made this website about incomes in the world. And you see the income of every family, but you don't just see the income, you see the picture of the family, you see them cooking, you see their car, you see their dog, and suddenly it becomes a very different story. You realize you cannot judge people to be poor or to be rich just on the basis of a number. If you look at this kind of life and the social context behind them, it's a very different story, right? So reconnecting to the social kind of origin of economics is, I think, something that designers, but also journalists can do a lot better. So the designer's engineer is a chapter that is a little bit about how we use kind of technology and efficient industrial production for design, just things like standards, but also things like maps that we have talked about before in this presentation. And what is interesting to point out is that during colonial times, the maps were not only made while people were on the ship, they were also sent home and then printed using the printing press, multiplied in many different amounts. And the reason is why is that so these were very risky very risky voyages. So they were backed by investors, and the investors needed the return evidence for the return on investment. Is my investment going to, yield return? So these maps were not just made for navigation, they were also made to show to the investors, look, this was all the land we stole for you. This is all the land that we're going to, pillage, and that we're going to take everything from this land. So maps in these colonial times were just as much for navigation as they were an evidence for investment. They were economic documents. And this also ties into this whole thing where the colonization of the Americas, for example, sped up this process where all land was considered to be like free game. Land that was owned by indigenous peoples could, if it wasn't used in the eyes of the Europeans, it just could be occupied and taken as territory. And this idea that land is actually private property is a very strange idea. Like the Romans already had this idea, but many indigenous cultures don't have this idea. They more believe that land is something that we share with our ancestors, share with the people that come after us, but also share with the animals and the nature around us. Many indigenous people see themselves as stewards of land, not owners of land. But this European enlightenment really like solidified this aspect that land is property and has to be privately owned. And this is the basis of capitalism, that land is privately owned. These are cadastral maps from France, from the French Revolution, where actually the cadastral mappers would draw the land of farmers more straight than it actually was, therefore emphasizing the kind of standardization of land as property. And this idea that once you own a piece of land, you can do it with you wish, even though you're polluting the land, even you're destroying the land, is still very much present, I think, in the way that we look at land. And maps, but also signs like this really had a really important role in doing this. In kind of communicating that land is property, it can be defended. Police will be used if you go onto somebody else's land, right? Rather than the idea that land might be something that we share. Land is something that we have responsibility over. And this is also something that in the climate crisis, I think, has become very important again, that we have to learn to appreciate the values of land that are not economic, but are just about preserving natural resources and also preserving, our natural environment that actually sustains us in the end. So this work by Iconoclastistas from Argentina, I think is really amazing. I love having their work in my book because they really try to use Western mapping against itself. Turning around the map, talking about the matriarchal origin of land, and this idea of, they also do a lot of mapping workshops. So I think it's really amazing that even though a lot of indigenous mapping practices were lost during colonization, I think that's very sad, that we can also use mapping as a kind of active political tool to kind of reclaim ownership of land as people, and rather than the large landowners. So I want to talk very shortly about education. I have a whole chapter about the design education. But what I learned about reading about the history of education is mostly that education in this kind of like solidified form as we know it now, mostly has the role of telling you to obey authority, right? So when you move from the family to the school, the idea is that the authority goes from the father to the school teacher. And this idea of public schooling, when public schools were introduced, really had to kind of communicate that idea that school was also a way to prepare for work, where the boss is or the husband is let's say your boss, and then at school you have to learn to obey authority. The teacher communicates the knowledge, and you have to basically just accept that knowledge and internalize it, repeat it, memorize it, right? Of course, this is not what education used to be. Education in many indigenous cultures is just playing. Adults take children on many different things. They learn together. Also, it's important to understand that the most important things that we learn in life, we don't learn in school, right? We learn them from our friends. We learn them from social experiences. We learn them in many different places. So saying that knowledge can only be acquired in school and needs a diploma is also a form of commodifying this knowledge. And it also doesn't really create critical thinkers. And this is what Paulo Freire, with the pedagogy of the oppressed, the Brazilian author, was really pointing out. During the Brazilian dictatorship, the military dictatorship, he was pointing out that if we see education as something that a teacher is kind of the boss over the students, telling the students what to think and what to memorize, then the students will never become critical thinkers. They can also never like understand how to understand a dictatorship and to also revolt against such a dictatorship. So this idea that education, and this really made a profound impact on me because I'm a teacher as well. So I started to also change my teaching, where I really see teaching more now as discussing with students, positing problems, discussing together, because I am well aware with 7 years of teaching experience, many of my students are a lot smarter or a lot more creative or have a lot more knowledge than I have in many different ways. And acknowledging that everybody has knowledge in their bodies from their experience is, I think, very fundamental. And just seeing as education as something that is commodified through a diploma that you can only get when you buy design education, which is also not cheap and not accessible for everyone, is also a way of freeing kind of education from this kind of constraints of kind of authority that we're currently, I think, still dealing with. Popular education, as Paulo Freire imagined it, is still being used in many different places, like, for example, here in New York City. For me, this also comes back to what I was telling before about the project with Camping Kafka, but also the project about youth and politics, where when you open yourself up to the people around you and the knowledge that people have, you realize the wealth of knowledge in society, and so many interesting things can happen from that moment onward. And I think that really has made me also optimistic about what to do about the current crises and how we can differently approach this, because we have all of these brilliant ideas of people that came before us that we can actually, use and try out. So in my book, I don't really end up with a solution. This is also because, after all, I am a white guy from Europe. So when I would say this is the solution, that would also just come from my, personal viewpoint. So I think it's also important that that there's different design cultures everywhere in the world. People need different kind of things to happen for themselves to give them a better life or a better work experience. But what I did do is I interviewed 6 collectives around the world that have been trying to resist kind of capitalist ways of working, of exploitation in design work for more than 10 years. And I just wanted to learn from them because I also don't have the answers. First of all, it is kind of interesting, and I do point this out in my book, that things like unionizing and using cooperatives as a form of business are, I think, very interesting. Unions have kind of, at least in Europe, been kind of ignored since the 1970s. There's a lot of journalism unions actually now in the US. There's a Gawker Media Guild. There's an Alphabet Workers Union for people who work at Google. There's a Fox Media Union. People at the New York Times were actually protesting to stop union busting. Look, if you have bad working conditions, and journalism around the world is, I think, suffering from that, people getting paid really poorly, people working freelance, I know photographers in the Netherlands, they get paid 50 euros for a picture that's on the front page. I mean, this is really, really insane. That we have to also get together and also demand that we get paid normally for our work, because these media companies are still making huge profits. So I think it's really important that if you want better working conditions for yourself, that you talk to your co-workers and you realize what you can do together, because if you join with other people, you always make a stronger case. And the same thing goes for designers. Stop with unpaid internships, not doing unpaid pitches, not working for certain clients. If you get together with many designers, then you can actually create change in the design world as well. So now I'm going to tell you about some of these cooperatives that I think are really amazing. So cooperative, for those who you don't know, is a form of business that has no hierarchy, right? No bosses. So everybody is the boss, basically. You decide things together, you get paid for the amount of time you put in. And this Cooperativa de Diseño from Buenos Aires, they are a feminist cooperative, which also allows them really to do really interesting things with their design work. For example, they talk about maternity leave and the role of this kind of unpaid labor that often women do in the home, like cooking and cleaning and all these things. So they are able to talk about all of these things even in the design workplace. So they work a lot for the feminist movement and for the pro-abortion movement in Argentina, but they also are product designers and they work for this factory, this collectivized factory in Buenos Aires as well. They do really amazing work. The second collective is Open Source Publishing from Belgium. They've been for 15 years doing design with only open source software. They don't use Adobe, they don't use Mac OS X. They program a lot, they make typefaces, they make websites, they make prints, they do a lot of design work. And they really believe, the reason why they use only open source software is they really believe that culture is a collective good. Culture cannot be privatized. And copyright is trying to do exactly that. Copyright is trying to say, no, this part of culture is mine. While all of us, we are standing on the shoulders of our forefathers. I could not have made this book with all the people that went before me. So it's really important to understand that all culture is created collectively. So using copyright does, in the end, only benefits really big companies who can afford all the lawyers to get away with stealing from young designers or small design studios. What's also really interesting about how they work is they put all their work online for free. You're able to download it, use it, even adapt it, but you have to credit them. So getting something for free doesn't mean that you don't owe to other people to tell you where you found something. And I think this is really interesting. I think it's also really interesting is that they try to work with their clients in such a way. They put all their sketches online from the first one to the last one. All their work is completely transparent. They have a very, very interesting view on design and how culture is created collectively. And you can find on their website a lot of resources about this. Brave New Alps in Italy, they're amazing. They studied in London. They were very critical of capitalism and design, and they didn't want to participate in this whole kind of, I want to be famous and I want to be the star designer and everybody else has to just work hard. But they realized they cannot do an ethical practice in such an expensive city as London. So they went to live where their parents live in the north of Italy, in the mountains, and they started there to really build a community role. From their design practice, they started to work together with local businesses. They started to lend their tools and lend their workshops and their printers to local businesses, starting to do jobs with them. And then they realized, yeah, but design is not about the kind of colors of our design and how our posters look. Design is about creating a local economy. They realized, well, when we work with local businesses and we spend our money in local businesses and we put our money back into the local business, we actually strengthen the rural economy. And rural economies worldwide are always struggling to make ends meet because a lot of money is going to multinationals in the cities. So strengthening your local economy, working with your neighborhood can be a really powerful way of being more immersed in your community, and it can be very rewarding. And they also said, look, we don't win awards because we use the cool typefaces and the cool colors. But what we're actually doing is much more profound than that. We're creating through our design, we're creating a social community, social networks that will last a lot longer than this poster. And I think this is amazing. Lastly, I want to talk about Media Ninja from Brazil. I was actually very lucky to visit them when they invited me to come to Brazil. This was like, I think 3 years ago. So what's really interesting is that they're a citizen journalism and media activist collective with over 200 members. It started in 2013. So there are protests in Brazil about the bus fares, but nobody was reporting on the protest. And the reason is because the media in Brazil, like in many countries, is owned by basically five big companies that are basically kind of, doing what the ruling class is basically telling them to do. So they refuse to report on these protests. So Media Ninja just started streaming this with their cell phones on the internet. They had such an impact with these protests. It was shared on CNN. It was shared in the New York Times and these really international news outlets. And they gained more than 8 million followers in their social media. Media Ninja is more a movement than I would say than journalists, but I think that's also really amazing. And they are also activists. They are really strong in also the anti-Bolsonaro activism. And the reason is they say, look, we're not neutral, but no journalist is neutral. A lot of journalists in Brazil claim that they are neutral, but they are doing corporate journalism. You know, they are dominated by a handful of media conglomerates owned by the country's wealthiest families. So it's really important to be very, very transparent about the way you make journalism and how you do it. But saying you're kind of neutral is also kind of like a myth in that sense. What's really amazing is that the people from Media Ninja, they live in communal houses. This is the only way they can afford their journalism, because they don't have a TV channel, they don't have a newspaper. What they do is they record all their journalism, their photography, their graphic design, and they put it on social media channels for free. You know, they put it on Instagram, they put it on Twitter, they put it on WhatsApp groups. And the reason why they do that is because that's the channels where the people are on. You know, and they get their money from people donating to them, you know, but they also can live very cheaply because they live in this communal houses. They spend very little money. They have their own currency. So they really try to, offer like a balance against those really big media companies. And they're doing it really amazingly. They live in these communal houses with, programmers, with journalists, with graphic designers, with photographers. People share tasks. So I found it very inspiring what they are doing. With all these collectives, I also say this does not mean that this is some kind of answer to the crisis we're currently facing, or it will solve your issues as a designer, whether you're not getting paid enough, or whether you cannot find enough jobs, or whether you're like not happy with your corporate clients. Everybody should choose their own path. So I also want to emphasize that I want to share this because these collectives really inspired me, but they're also really specific on their location and also on the people that run them. So everybody has to also find their own path in this. And I think this is also important because I also don't want to claim that I have the truth, or the books that I write offer a kind of truth. This is just my vision from my knowledge in my work and in my life that I want to share. And also, want you to challenge that and take that in your own direction. And I hope also people will build on that and do with that, kind of their own things. So it was a great pleasure for me to be invited at Latinográficas. Hopefully I will return soon to Latin America. I don't know when, to meet some of you in person. You can find me on these channels here. Thank you so much for inviting me. And thank you, Jasmine and Maria, for hosting this today.
Thank you, Ruben. That was great, really. And thank you for sharing projects that you admire. That was actually one of the questions that I wanted to ask you. And yeah, so now we're gonna jump directly into the questions, because there are some here, and I don't want to take up a lot of time from you. I'm going to start with a question from Julieta. She's from Argentina. She's one of Latinográficas fellows. And she says that in the past years in Latin America, the right has earned a lot of power. I will say that in the whole world, really. And most votes for the right come from young people, from very young populations. And in Argentina, especially, a lot of them are part of the informal economy. What strategies do you think that we can adopt from design to try to have a dialogue with these populations? I think you kind of touched on that during your presentation. Another question is, what mistakes you think what communication mistakes the left has done in the past?
Yeah, thank you. So the first question, so I'm not a politician, I'm not a strategist, so I cannot give you advice about how to contact youth. What I realize also in the Netherlands, because we have a similar thing, it's not that young people all vote left wing. A lot of them are more aware of the climate crisis, definitely. Also in the Netherlands, we have a graying population. So compared to Latin America, we have a larger group of people that is, let's say, the baby boomers, so the post-war generation. So they're like in their 60s and 70s now. They own almost all of the property and they have all of the capital, basically. So a lot of young people in the Netherlands now have study debt. They cannot find a house and they're afraid of the climate. So they have a lot of different issues. But some of them then take that knowledge and then start voting for right-wing, even fascist parties, right? So Media Ninja is actually really amazing in how they try to use their power during elections. So I would actually ask you to go to their website and look at them. So one of their projects was, what was it again? I don't know the name in Portuguese, but the idea was that if everyone that wants to vote for Lula goes out on the street and talks to people and try to convince somebody, or at least talk to them, you know, in a respectable way. So it became this whole thing, you know, like, so yes, you can make memes, you can make posters, but in the end, the best thing is to talk to people. So in this campaign, many people went on the streets talking to people, exchanging arguments, you know, and it's not about convincing people, because people are allowed for their own political opinion. You don't want to indoctrinate people. You don't want to tell people vote this, because you want to respect people's autonomy, right? But especially when people are from lower income groups, yes, you know, they also see that this leftist president has not done for them what they wanted, you know, or like also. I'm also not saying like we should all vote socialist or communist, because the history has shown that this can also go wrong in many different ways. Whether we look at Venezuela or whether we look at Soviet Russia or even at Cuba, this is very difficult. So I'm not even saying like left or right. I am for a more social and more egalitarian type of politics. But yeah, what works in your particular country and what your particular language, I think depends mostly on the people, what they need, you know. For example, I know the Colombian situation a bit, and the reason why many people who are actually very poor were still voting against Petro in the last election, were voting for the basically the big landowners, is because they're also afraid that, you know, it will happen, what happens in Venezuela will happen in Colombia. You know, and they already have difficulty making ends meet, so they don't want to risk change, you know. So you have to convince people that it's in their best interest, and it's also up to the politicians to have a convincing story and not just appeal to the kind of intellectual class, but also to communicate your ideas in the most simple way, you know. So yeah, if you start talking to somebody, like in my neighborhood, I live like in a working class neighborhood in Amsterdam. If I start talking to people about pronouns, people are like, what are you talking about? I cannot pay my energy bill, you know? So this is also what kind of community organizing is about, that you have to find common ground with the people you're talking to, you know? And you will not agree on everything, but it's important to find common ground and to respect each other's kind of autonomy, political autonomy. Yeah, that also brings me maybe to the second question. In the Netherlands, the left is really doing horribly, and the idea behind this project about youth and politics was actually to to help the left communicate better. But they are all high educated. They go to universities. They're all white, high educated Dutch people. They use words I don't understand. You know, it's just like I don't understand. You know, like so what I mean, I have a bit of an issue with parliamentary politics. That's also why I kind of tell people voting every 4 years is not enough. That's not what politics is about. Politics is about talking to your neighbors. You know, and right now in my apartment building, they have trouble with the rent was rising so fast now with the electricity bills because of the war between Russia and Ukraine. And the neighborhood is not organized because people, this is a working class neighborhood, they're all renting, people only live here for 6 months or 1 year, they're not organized. So organizing people in my apartment building, for example, is really important. But they you know, they don't read, you know, these books about neoliberalism. You know, if you, I went to this protest in the neighborhood and I had a sign that had the word gentrification on, and this young guy came to me and he said, "What does gentrification mean?" So if you make a protest sign and people don't understand the word on your sign, then you did something wrong, right? So in my experience, I'm higher educated. I went to like a kind of trade school for design. So that means I am more educated than the average of Dutch society. So I should also be aware that most of the words that I use, or many of the words that I use, or the ideas that I use, maybe do not resonate with them, and that doesn't say anything about intelligence. I'm not saying anything about that. I think it's very important that you understand that people have very different skill sets, you know, and everybody has tremendous amounts of knowledge, but you have to be able to speak people's language. And right now, parliamentary politics has not done that. You know, they're busy with themselves. They wear suits. You know, my friends don't wear suits. Nobody in this neighborhood wears suits. Why do they wear suits? So, and they are busy with, you know, parties and this party, and I don't care about all these things. So yes, I would ask you to vote, but I think it's also important to kind of organize people locally, and people have done that, you know, like in Colombia doing the Paro Nacional, people were doing assemblies in the neighborhoods, people were helping each other. So when, and also you saw that during COVID-19, when there's important issues, then people will get together, you know, and people will understand each other and people want to help each other. It's basically the capitalist system that is driving us to compete with one another and to try to get each other's jobs and to try to, you know, make profit over the other person. But I think deep down, we don't like this. This is not who we are. And you don't have to call it socialism, but at least getting rid of this kind of like really, you know, this force of capital that is destroying the nature. And I think in Latin America, this is something that unites people as well. The love for nature is something that people on all political sides share. It's just that some people share that while they're still destroying nature, you know. So it's important to love the nature, but also, yeah, also understand that you have to take action while preserving that.
Thank you, Ruben. At some point in your presentation, you mentioned that the designer is also a learner. An educator. And I was thinking that you're also a learner. And I was wondering what made you start to feel uncomfortable with the career you chose? Was it a book? Was it a professor? I guess I want to know, is it something at university that graphic designers and even journalists should learn to have a better approach to their careers, a more public-minded approach to the jobs that they have chosen?
Verda, yes. No, first of all, I think people practice different kind of design, and you know, like I share studio with type designers. They have a very different practice and they work very differently. So yeah, I don't want to tell people what to do or you know what to choose. Maybe what I learned in my own career is first of all, I come from a family of care workers. So my family are nurses, they work in child psychology and they work in psychology. So choosing design was not like a logical choice for me. And I was always brought up that helping other people is the most, is the best you can do in society. I wasn't brought up that I had to be an artist or I had to become wealthy. And this is basically for my education. I always enjoyed studying design. I also enjoyed working as a designer, also at studios. I think designers are very generous people, and I had very great experiences working at small design studios. I know there's different experiences, but generally designers are very nice to each other. They like working together. Designers have to work together. What I didn't like is that the clients that came in always came in with kind of bullshit jobs. It's like, you want me to rebrand this company, but it just was rebranded 2 years ago, So yeah, people come to you because they have money, and yeah, many people have important things to discuss, but they don't have money. And you see the same in journalism, that stories that do well in clickbait, that have the right hashtags, or stories that are about issues that people want to know about. Yeah, these are the things that go trending, and there's this kind of, it's very difficult to get out of that, to kind of stop and think, okay, if I have some time in my schedule, and that's also a thing, if you have to work 5 days a week, you don't have time for anything, So freeing my own time was a very important step in that. And in order to do that, I first had to work to build up some savings, to get a house and everything. So this is also part of that. But through working as a designer for 10 years, I also learned how the practice of design really works, how it is to make banners for, McDonald's. I've worked for banks, I worked for museums, I worked for all these different companies, I worked for governments and art institutions. So that really gave me a lot of kind of practical knowledge, like life knowledge that I based my book on. So my book is not just, I read some books about capitalism and economy, and this is what I'm now presenting to you. No, I write about these things because I've been there. I've done the working all weekends, and I've done, the late night work, and I've had the horrible bosses and everything, right? So there was not really one moment that changed me. It was just that for me, I was always reading a lot. I was also always kind of politically active in a smaller way. And it was that after working for 10 years, I was like, okay, now I need to change something. And there was a master program that I really liked that also focused a little bit on politics and storytelling. And I started doing that. And that gave me kind of the headspace to reorganize my practice, right? Because to think about your skills, what you can do and how to use them most effectively is very difficult if you're just answering the question from the client or from your boss. You're just you're just solving problems all day. You're just all day in this kind of like design mode. So I needed these 2 years of a master to kind of, calm down and to understand. Maybe other people don't need that. Other people maybe are quicker than me into learning or smarter than me. And that's also really great. But sometimes it can be good to take a step back and to put some headspace and to really think about, okay, what is it do I want to do? And also what kind of future do I see with this kind of work? And that kind of led to my new practice.
All right, Ruben, thank you so much for joining us today. We're gonna end on that note. Really, thank you for the time, the effort that you put into the presentation. It was really, really interesting. So I want to thank you and thank everyone who came today, and on behalf of El Surti's team. And I want to invite you also to our next masterclass, which will be with Natalia Viana, who's co-founder of Agencia Pública. She's an amazing journalist, and she's going to join us on November the 3rd. So I hope to see you there, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you so much.
Bye, Maria Laura. Thank you so much. Bye, Ruben. Bye-bye.